Hello and welcome back to our lecture series on how to write your EcoS term paper or master's thesis. Today I'm going to talk about the empirical part. The overview, as usual, I will remind you where we are standing in our overall structure of the thesis. Then we will look at pretty much the same questions. What is it all about? What do you need to do? I will provide a few examples into single categories that I mentioned. Then I will try to highlight how all this works with one of our standard examples that we've been using throughout this lecture series. And I will conclude by telling you how many points you get for which categories that you need to consider when writing your paper, and of course also to help you understand how I will grade your performance. So that's the usual basic structure. As you see, we finished the theoretical part. Last time we concluded by talking about the analytical framework, and now we moved to the second larger part of your thesis, the empirical part, and with those two sub-criteria that I'm also going to mention a little later. Yeah, well, the only function is actually to collect information. Information, we discussed this before, can be actual numbers, it could be qualitative information, and so on. The crucial thing is that you do this in a structured way, in a predefined way. You aim at answering your research question. You do not collect your data randomly, but you collect them according to your analytical framework, as discussed in the previous lecture. The good news is that, as I outlined here on the second point here on this slide, the heavy lifting in terms of difficult tasks has actually been done at this point. This is not to say that this is going to be easy. On the contrary, finding data, especially if you know what you're looking for, can actually be very hard and sometimes also very frustrating if you look for a precise figure and it's just not there, or you can't find it. What I'm trying to say is that I think this is something that most of you are used to. That's what you've done before. And here, it's not so much your intellectual creativity or your systematic thinking that's required. It's actually about very honest, hard work. And in my experience, all my students are really perfectly capable of doing this. So I have no doubts that you will not face too many difficulties with the task as such. As I said, once you come across a criterion for which you can't find data, no matter how hard you find, this can be very frustrating, but this is something that can be managed. So you need to find data, but if you've done the theoretical part right, and I really hope you did so. In any case, we will communicate about this also to make sure that's the case, especially for master's thesis. Then you basically know what you need, and you can direct your energy into a more targeted effort at finding data. So I would argue it's in principle, this is not really a big challenge for most of you. But then again, don't underestimate it. It will still take time, and it's not something that you can do on one day either. So how do you proceed? There is a number of key points that I just want to emphasize. I really think they are more or less self-evident, but for the sake of completeness, let me just say that you have to apply all the criteria from your analytical framework. AF stands for analytical framework, okay? All criteria means that you shouldn't add any criteria that have not been included in the analytical framework, and you shouldn't omit any criteria. Like you have 10 criteria and you provide data on only 9 of them, or 8, that would not be okay. No additions, no omissions. Also, the order of appearance. I mean, yeah, there is no strongly compelling reason why you should do that, but I also don't see why you shouldn't. So if you have criteria 1, 2, 3 in your analytical framework, I would actually expect you to apply them exactly in that order in your empirical part, rather than starting with criterion number 3, then proceeding to number 7 and, jumping back and forth. If you find that more logical, perfectly fine, but then please also adjust the order in your analytical framework so that that would actually fit. In fact, the analytical framework would provide the substructure of your empirical part. So that is actually, at least in principle, relatively easy. Many of you will write about a comparison of something. If you do so, there are basically two ways how you can do that. You can proceed by case or by country, or you can proceed by criteria. I usually recommend that you go for the second option. So yeah, I'm going to show you the example of the mobile phone in a minute. Rather than writing about mobile phone number 1, listing all its features, and then mobile phone number 2, listing all its features, it's much better you go by feature. So you look at the price and you compare the prices of your sample size, whatever that is, 3, 4, 5 mobile phones, and then you move on to a screen size, and then you move on to battery life, etc., etc. That's definitely much more useful, because if the comparison is really what you're aiming at, this is what your readers are interested to know, right? They want to know similarities and differences. They don't want to have 4 or 5 separate descriptive papers on each of those phones and then more or less forcing them to extract and compare criteria by themselves. That's something that you should do for your readers. One of them is me, but there might be others as well. I also added this point about not worrying to be repetitive. Sometimes students ask me, oh, you know, if I have this kind of preliminary conclusion after each criterion, and then I would repeat this in the final analytical part, am I really allowed to do that? Yes, of course you are. And I think it actually makes perfect sense. You might have experienced that yourself, that sometimes repetition is actually not such a bad thing. And in this case, it even makes sense. So people usually, they read academic works also selectively. It doesn't really happen very often with people read, well, but journal articles maybe, but with academic books, it's actually not always the case from like the first to the last word. Usually you go to the table of contents and look for something that interests you most. So if someone is interested in your comparison, going back to this smartphone example, in your comparison of prices, then they will only read that section on prices in the empirical part, you know, looking at all the data you found, etc. And they will be interested to see more or less instantly what is the result, right? What is the best price or the lowest price or highest price and so on. Some people might actually not be interested in just this one criterion price, but they might be interested in your overall conclusion. They will actually skip the empirical part and go straight to the analytical part where you actually present the results in their entirety. So it's no problem being repetitive. If you are too repetitive, of course, I mean, it's like what Paracelsus said, the secret is in the dose, actually. But if you apply this in a reasonable way, there's no problem. So you don't have to worry about this. Just use your common sense, use your brains, and then I think you're going to be fine. Yes, I have quality of data in my grading criteria, and sometimes students ask me, what do you mean by quality of data? I'm trying to explain this a little more in detail here. So first of all, you have to provide data selectively, not like everything you find, because some of it might be more relevant, other stuff might not. Also, we have this problem of reliability of sources. So some data are more valuable or of a higher quality, simply depending on the way how they have been produced. That's why we usually have a bit of a problem with stuff like Wikipedia, because it doesn't have a single author, or websites of governments, because they usually have a very strong bias, because they have been produced by those very agencies, usually for a purpose. I discussed this in a bit more depth in another short lecture on other criteria, so I just mentioned this here very briefly, but then again, I think it should be relatively evident what I'm trying to tell you here. You should also make sure that your data set is as complete as possible. I would also include this in data. Like if you promised to find data on something and I have the impression that something crucial is missing, and that's obvious, in that case, I would also deduct points for quality. Now, what happens if you don't find data that you're looking for? This is going to happen. That is a more or less normal side effect of our academic approach, where you first define what you want to find in terms of data, and then go in the field. Remember my discussion of, journalism versus academic research, right? If you predefine what you want to find, you can't really be certain whether data is even out there, right? I mean, you are expected to be kind of realistic already when building your analytical framework, but then on the other hand, you should actually aim for the best possible result. And only then reality will kick in, and then you might actually have to readjust your research. You should be driven in any case by your research question and by your analytical framework, and not necessarily by the actual data that you find. Remember, we discussed this before. So what do you do if you do not find data you've been looking for? Well, the worst thing you can do is to just leave those data out and hope that nobody will notice. I promise you somebody will notice. So rather be frank and open and transparent about it. Say that I've been looking for this kind of information. I looked really hard and I couldn't find it. You have to convince me, when we go back to term papers and master's thesis, you have to convince me, otherwise you would have to convince your readers that you actually tried hard and explored all available data sources. So if you, for example, tell me that you couldn't find the GDP figure for South Korea for 2015, I will very likely not believe you, because that is data that is widely available. If you tell me that you couldn't find a figure on the spending of North Korea on mobile missile launchers in 2020, I would be inclined to believe you, because this data, it's somewhere, but it's actually very hard to find. Okay, let me just repeat my favorite example of a former student who wrote about China's space program. It's actually quite amazing what is out there, and if you really look hard enough, you can often find more than you would even expect yourself. But there will be those cases where you do not find information you're looking for. That could be a result in itself, right? The non-availability of data, that's a result. That's interesting, because it immediately triggers questions. Why is that not available? Or are we probably looking in the wrong places? Might we need to perhaps identify and explore new sources? So you might actually be triggering some follow-up research by people, or you might trigger an academic debate where people say, no, wait a second, he claims this is not available, but I actually think it is. And then, things can go back and forth, and this is how fields can actually develop. So, in principle, there's nothing wrong about not finding data, as long as you try hard, you prove that you tried hard enough, and as long as you are transparent and open about it, right? Do not try to hide it away. This is not something that's going to work. All right, in terms of an example, I kind of believe this is relatively easy, just for the sake of completeness. Remember perhaps this table here that was part of my lecture on the analytical framework. That was one of our imaginary topics on comparing the latest smartphones, and these were some of the criteria that I had listed here that you might want to look at. So you, in your empirical part now, you actually work through all those criteria, remember, in the order of their appearance. If you don't like the order, you change it in the analytical framework, and then you can actually also change it in the empirical part. So you look at all that stuff like screen size, battery life, brand image, and all the other criteria, all of them, right? Do not leave out any criterion that you had listed in your final table of the analytical framework. If you come across a feature of smartphones that you find is actually relevant, and it's not yet included in your analytical framework, well, first of all, it means that you haven't done your literature review, right? But as long as you haven't submitted your term paper or thesis, there's no problem at all. All you have to do is you go back to your literature review, and you add the discussion on that. Of course, it means you have to read a little more. Then you can add price, including the unit of measurement and sources for data in your analytical framework. And then you can also include this kind of data in your empirical part. Here in our example, I said, for example, you missed that price might actually be a criterion, and then this is how you would proceed to complete your work. Actually, this does happen because you will stop doing your literature review at some point. I told you the magic point is when you stop finding new evidence. But I mean, it could always happen that you just haven't been looking at the right literature. So the source kind of dried out. You didn't find any new criteria. And then all of a sudden, if you move on to empirical sources and try to collect data and look at, for example, government statistics, World Bank statistics or something, they might start listing items that somehow appear to be really important to you, but then you figure out, oh, wait a second, I haven't included them. It's fine. You know, it's kind of a loop. Then you go back to a previous step, improve the quality of that step, make sure that it's kind of coherent throughout your thesis, and fantastic. This is how you can improve your own work. So there's nothing wrong here, right? In our sample, you would also, in our example, sorry, you would also proceed according to what I had suggested when it comes to comparing. You compare screen sizes first, or prices, or battery lives. Then after each criterion, you would perhaps also already have kind of an intermediary summary saying, well, you know, in terms of screen size, phone number A has the biggest screen and phone number B has the second biggest screen, and so on. You measure the battery life and say, well, you know, phone C actually has the longest battery life. Phone A is actually worst amongst the 5 examples that I have here. So you look at all your phones in your sample according to one criterion, then you move on to the next one. What you should not write about, again, just picking an example here, is the history of smartphone brands, if this has not been part of your analytical framework from the very beginning. So, you know, you look for information and you find all this glossy papers telling you about the history of the iPhone or of Samsung, and you think, hey, that's cool, I want to include this. That is not okay if it's not part of your analytical framework. If you, again, think, oh my God, this is a relevant information, perfectly fine. Then you go to literature review, add it there, add it to your analytical framework, and then you can write about it. But otherwise, don't do it, okay? And also do not omit information on something that is part of your analytical framework. In that case, battery life was listed there, right, in the table. So you have to write something about battery life. You cannot just leave it out. It's actually important that you check this before submitting your term paper. Make sure, okay, I have all these categories in my analytical framework. Sometimes there are really many of them, so it could happen that some of them slip away and you simply forgot to cover them. Just to make sure before you submit your result of your research that these things, they actually match. Right, and after all I said, this is now the grading. You will receive a total of 12 points for your empirical part. 6 points, like half of them, on whether your analytical framework has actually been applied. Has it been applied? Has it been applied completely? Has it been applied in the right order? And so on and so on. And then, yeah, the other on facts, quantity, quality, etc., all things that I have already discussed. Okay, I don't really think that was something excitingly new to you. I think many of the points I mentioned are self-evident. Nevertheless, I thought it's a good idea to repeat them to make sure that we all are pretty much on the same line here. And yeah, I hope you will have actually fun searching for those data. You know, once the structure is there, it's really nice. You know, you get up in the morning and you know, okay, today I'm looking for information according to my second or third criterion. You know exactly what to do. You already have been thinking about where to find all that stuff. So it can actually be a very satisfying experience. And then you see, you know, how your thesis is growing, how the structure is now filled with actual information. You will also have your first preliminary results, and you might actually encounter something that you didn't expect. So, you know, this is a very rewarding part also of research. So at least I hope that you will have such a positive experience, and I also hope that this lecture was able to help you a little bit in achieving this. So thank you very much again for your attention, and I'm looking forward to seeing you for one of my next short lectures on how to write an EcoS term paper or master's thesis. Goodbye.